Chinese Vice President Xi Jinping has met with U.S. President Barack Obama in Washington in an effort to smooth out the country's differences. Tensions between the two nations escalated recently, with the U.S. criticizing China's currency policies and Washington bolstering its military presence in the Asian Pacific. For more on the current relations, we're joined by Paul Craig Roberts, who served as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury during the Reagan administration. So both China and the U.S. have said they want to clear up their differences. How far do you think Xi Jinping's visit can go to address these concerns?
The main problem with the Chinese-United States relationship is Washington's drive for world hegemony. And that makes it very difficult to have a real relationship. The reason for the American NATO attack on Libya was to deny China the benefits of its oil investments in eastern Libya. And of course, Iran is now in the western sites, and Iran accounts for 20% of China's oil. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for Washington to go to China and say, look, embargo yourself from Iranian oil and let us put an American puppet in office in that country as well, so we can prevent your economic development from catching up to us too quickly. I think that's what the real game is. The United States is trying to slow down China's economic rise because it sees that rise as a threat to continuing American hegemony.
Now, you keep making this point about hegemony, but isn't that making it one step too far? I mean, doesn't it just seem that the United States is actually just looking at the world as it is and trying to make the best geopolitical decisions it can, given the hand it's dealt, basically?
No. When the Soviet Union collapsed, this gave the neoconservatives a chance to come to the forefront. It took about a decade for them to develop their doctrines and to maneuver themselves into influence. And then with the so-called terrorist attack of September 11th, with the Bush administration, this gave them their chance. And the wars for hegemony began. And that's what has been going on in the Middle East and in Afghanistan for a decade, and has now expanded into Africa. And Syria and Iran are also in the sights. So the argument of the neoconservatives is that with the Soviet collapse, there's no check on American power. And so as the United States is the indispensable nation, and as its social, political, economic system is the only one that works, we have a right and a responsibility to impose this system on the rest of the world. It's kind of like a replay of the French Revolution 200 years ago. So it's an ideology, a new ideology of expansion that has come up. I mean, why in the world does the United States think it should put Marines in Australia?
I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt you here, but I want to move on to the next question. One area of dispute is China's trade and currency policies, something many Americans blame for job losses in their country's manufacturing sector. Do you think that's warranted?
No, not really. The reason China originally pegged its currency to the dollar was when it was making its transition out of a communist country into a capitalist country, and it wanted to assure the world that its currency was good as the dollar. That's the reason it pegged it. Now, the reason for the Chinese trade surplus with the United States is not simply the Chinese currency being undervalued. It's all the American firms that took their own production for American markets offshore to China. So when you produce offshore for your home market, when the goods and services come back into the United States, they come in as imports. So the trade deficit with China is at least 50% due to the offshoring of jobs and production by the American corporations.
Now, China is the U.S. largest foreign creditor. So, how much leverage does Washington have to make on? How much leverage does Washington have to make demands on Beijing?
Well, that question, I think, used to be clear that the largest creditor had a certain amount of influence. But you see, what's happened is the Federal Reserve has been monetizing the Treasury debt, and yet the interest rates stay zero. So if the Federal Reserve is able to finance Washington's deficits without some sort of hyperinflation breaking loose, then the United States no longer needs China as a creditor. It has the Federal Reserve. And so for the past several years, we have seen quantitative easing 1, quantitative easing 2, and essentially it's continuation now because the Federal Reserve is buying enough bonds to keep the interest rate zero. So we have the central bank now financing the United States government, so it's less dependent on Chinese purchases. Nevertheless, the trade surplus from China has to be recycled somewhere. And it appears that China is still mainly recycling it into dollar assets.
Unfortunately, we have to end it there. Paul Craig Roberts, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, thanks for your time.